The clock struck just after 2 in the morning. The desert wind whistled like a broken flute, dragging clouds of dust that battered against the window of a small wooden house lost in the middle of nowhere. The silence was almost absolute, so dense it seemed to weigh on the chest, when an unexpected sound cut through the darkness. The hiss of an old radio, one of those huge devices with a round knob and wooden case, forgotten in the corner of the room. The strange detail was that the house had no electricity. The last storm had knocked down the wires days ago, and the protagonist, David Miller, had already resigned himself to spending nights illuminated only by the flickering flame of a lamp. Still, the radio came to life. First a dry crackle, then a sequence of metallic noises, interspersed with something that sounded like Morse code, but more irregular, almost organic, as if it came from a mouth trying to imitate machines. David rose slowly, his heart racing, feeling his throat dry up. He had served in the army years before, but never in his life had he heard anything so disturbing. As he approached the radio, it seemed like the room's walls were vibrating along with it, as if every speck of dust had been summoned to witness that moment. Suddenly, amid the hiss, a sequence of numbers stood out, repeated several times. 37, 16, 115, 47. Coordinates. David wasn't any navigation expert, but he immediately recognized that he was faced with something precise. Directed! He grabbed a crumpled piece of paper from the table, scribbling the numbers with trembling hands. Only afterward did he realize. Those coordinates pointed to a specific point on Highway 375, the legendary extraterrestrial highway, a desolate stretch of asphalt that wound not far from there, right on the outskirts of the famous Area 51. David blinked several times, trying to convince himself he was awake. His breathing echoed in the silence. With each repetition of the codes, the sensation grew. He wasn't just hearing frequencies. He was being called. The radio then emitted one last crackle and went silent. The hiss died, as if it had never existed. The room plunged back into darkness and silence, leaving only David's lost gaze, fixed on those coordinates. A shiver ran down his spine. Something inside him knew that, from that night on, nothing in his life would ever be the same. As he lowered his eyes to the scribbled paper, David noticed that, without realizing it, he had drawn lines around the numbers, forming a kind of symbol, an imperfect circle crossed by 2 lines. He didn't remember doing that. But there it was, before him, like an invisible signature confirming it wasn't a coincidence. The desert sun showed no mercy. Every morning, when the first rays cut the horizon, the heat already began to melt the fragile calm that the dawn brought. For David Miller, each sunrise seemed the same as the last. Heavy, repetitive, meaningless. At 46 years old, he was an ordinary man, almost invisible to the world. He had worked his whole life as a mechanic in a rundown shop by the roadside, a place that survived more out of habit than clientele. The concrete floor was always stained with burnt oil, and the air smelled of rust mixed with gasoline. David spent hours bent over old engines, as if every loose bolt was a reminder of everything that had broken inside him. He lived alone in a rusty trailer, parked in the midst of the desert vastness. There were no neighbors nearby. The phone rarely rang. The mail almost never brought anything but forgotten bills. His life could be summed up in a handful of dull routines. Wake up early, bitter coffee, shop, fix cars for lost tourists. Go home, cheap beer, and static TV. Nothing more. David carried regrets he preferred not to name. A broken marriage. A son who had decided never to seek him out again. Friends lost over time, like sand carried by the wind. The weight of loneliness didn't come from a single event, but from the sum of small surrenders. He had stopped dreaming and settled for existing. But since that strange September night, something had become different. The old radio, which had come to life even without power, began emitting hisses in the following days. Always at the same time, just after 2 in the morning. David tried to ignore it, turning over in bed, putting pillows over his ears. But it was impossible. The sound infiltrated his mind, as if calling his name. At first he tried to rationalize it. Maybe interference from military planes from Area 51. Maybe some distant neighbor tinkering with amateur radio equipment. The problem was that the sounds were different. They weren't just noises. They were metallic voices, spaced out, like someone trying to speak through water or glass. One night, David swore he heard his own name whispered amid the hisses. He jumped up frightened, heart pounding, and turned off the living room light. peering out the window. The desert looked normal, but a strange sense of presence spread through the air. It didn't take long for other signs to start happening. Objects in his house changed places. A key he swore he left on the table appeared on the floor. A mug disappeared from the sink and showed up on the counter. His wristwatch stopped working always at the same time, 2:14 a.m., and then, inexplicably, resumed marking time normally. Little by little, David was overcome by doubt. Was he going crazy, or was he truly being watched? He began noting each occurrence in an old notebook. At first they were just senseless scribbles. Hiss at 2:07. Glass fell by itself. But as the days passed, the list grew. The voices repeated. The objects moved. The watch stopped. Everything followed a pattern. Even without admitting it, he knew he was facing something bigger than he could comprehend. The desert, which had always been his silent prison, now seemed to hide secrets that revealed themselves only to him. David, the man forgotten by the world, was beginning to feel like he was being chosen for something he didn't yet understand. One night, while noting the hisses in his notebook, a gust of wind flung open the trailer door. David got up to close it, and for an instant, swore he saw a silhouette standing in the dark near the desert, tall, motionless, as if watching him. When he blinked, there was nothing, just sand, night, and the relentless noise of the wind. The early morning was especially silent. The wind, which usually sang between the trailer's metal sheets, had ceased, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. David tried to sleep, but his eyes remained open, fixed on the yellowed ceiling from age. He already knew what would come next. As in every night that week, the radio would come to life on its own, and that's exactly what happened. At 2:14 the hiss began, soft at first, then more intense, until it filled every corner of the small trailer. But this time, something changed. Amid the metallic noises, the voices finally formed words. Come. Highway 375, mile marker 23. David jumped up, his whole body covered in goosebumps. He rushed to the radio, as if he could wrench answers from inside the wooden box. The phrase repeated, once, twice, 3 times, and then silence returned to dominate. He stood frozen, panting, staring at that device like one stares at a sentence. Part of him wanted to believe it was just a delusion, the fruit of sleepless nights and a tired mind. But another part, an instinctive, visceral part, knew it wasn't madness. It was a call. In the following days, David tried to ignore it. He convinced himself it made no sense to risk his life for a mysterious voice. It's paranoia, he murmured to himself, while drinking bitter coffee and scribbling to-do lists he would never complete. But every time he closed his eyes, the phrase echoed in his mind, like a persistent buzz. Come. Highway 375. Mile marker 23. He began debating with himself. Fear said to stay. Fear reminded him that people disappeared in that region, that strange stories circulated in roadside bars, always with a cursed ending. But curiosity was stronger. Curiosity promised that there was something bigger there, something that could finally give meaning to his life lost in the desert. On a moonless night, David made his decision. He pulled an old backpack from under the bed, threw in some tools, a flashlight, water bottles, and a map folded in 4. He laced up his dry leather boots and headed to the shop, where his car rested under the zinc cover. The vehicle was as tired as its owner, peeling paint, sputtering engine, but it still ran. When he turned the ignition, the engine sound mixed with the deep silence of the desert, breaking the stillness of the early morning. The headlights illuminated the dirt road, revealing dust suspended in the air. For an instant, David hesitated. He took a deep breath, rested his forehead on the steering wheel, and whispered, "Whatever it is, I need to know." He grabbed the map and located mile marker 23 on Highway 375. It wasn't too far, but the path seemed longer than any trip he had ever made. The desert at night was an overwhelming vastness, where every shadow could hide secrets and every curve seemed to lead nowhere. As he drove, he felt like he was being watched. The headlights illuminated only a few meters ahead, but beyond that circle of light there was absolute darkness, deep, almost liquid. The starry sky was so vast it felt like it swallowed the road itself. It was at that moment he noticed something curious. The car radio, which never worked right, began emitting the same hiss. Weak at first, then stronger, until it turned into a constant buzz. David twisted the knobs, but there was no way to turn it off. The sound seemed to come from the air itself. For a moment, he thought of giving up, turning back, returning to the trailer and hiding under the blankets like a normal man would. But something in the back of his mind repeated, "You've already passed the point of no return." Before continuing, if this video is useful to you, take a moment to subscribe, leave your like, and comments. The road stretched out before him like an infinite scar. Each kilometer traveled was like crossing an invisible threshold, moving further away from his ordinary life and closer to something he couldn't name. When he finally spotted the sign indicating mile marker 23, a shiver ran down his spine. He was there. The place was waiting for him. And, for the first time in many years, David felt he had a purpose. The rusted sign marked 23, faintly reflecting the light from the car's headlights. David pulled over to the shoulder, turned off the engine, and let the desert silence swallow him. The air seemed denser there, almost electric, as if the environment itself reacted to his presence. For a few seconds, he just sat there, hands on the wheel, eyes fixed on the darkness. There was nothing around, just sand, rocks, and the infinite line of the horizon. Still, the feeling of being guided didn't leave him. He grabbed the flashlight and got out of the car, hearing the creak of the old doors like an annoying echo in that stillness. Each step on the dry ground raised small clouds of dust that gleamed under the beam of light. After a few minutes walking toward nothing, he saw something. At first, it looked like a distant reflection, but as he approached, the shape gained contours. A large metallic trailer, with an ancient appearance, parked in the midst of the void. The structure had sides covered in rust, but, inexplicably, yellowish lights escaped through the window cracks. David stopped, stunned. He had lived in that region his whole life, and had never seen that trailer there. It was impossible for something so large to have appeared suddenly in such a deserted place without anyone noticing. A shiver ran down his spine. The atmosphere around seemed altered. The wind, which had blown in dry gusts before, now moved in circles, raising dust devils that danced around the structure. The air had a metallic smell, like oxidized iron, mixed with ozone, like the scent that precedes an electrical storm. David turned off the flashlight for a moment. The internal lights of the trailer remained on, flickering like trembling candles. There was something unsettling in knowing that the construction seemed abandoned, and at the same time inhabited. He took a deep breath, trying to control the anxiety burning in his chest. He took a few more steps, approaching slowly, until he stopped in front of the door. He placed his hand on the doorknob but hesitated. The metal was cold, icy as if it had been left in ice, despite the hot desert night. His heart was beating so hard it seemed to echo in his ears. Every fiber of his body screamed to go back, to run, to pretend he had never heard those voices on the radio. But something even more powerful pushed him forward. The certainty that his life had been led to that point for a reason. He turned the doorknob. The door creaked, breaking the silence like a muffled scream. Inside, the environment made no sense. The space seemed larger than the structure could accommodate from the outside. The walls were covered with geometric drawings made with some kind of luminous substance that pulsed faintly, as if breathing. Triangles, circles, intertwined lines, symbols that didn't belong to any known language. On an improvised table, some objects were scattered, small spheres that floated a few centimeters above the surface, spinning slowly, like planets in orbit. On the floor, circular burn marks resembled the remnants of some experiment. David took a step inside. He felt the air weigh down as if gravity was slightly altered. His movements were slow, and even his breathing seemed to struggle to keep up. A low, almost imperceptible sound began to vibrate in the space. It didn't come from any specific object, but from the walls themselves. It was a deep hum that reverberated in his chest, affecting his mind more than his ears. He touched the wall with his fingertips. The surface was alive, warm, pulsing, and at that instant, a sudden sensation took hold of his body. He wasn't alone. His eyes darted quickly from one corner to another, but there was no one visible. Still, the presence was undeniable, as if something was watching him, silent, waiting for his next move. David stopped in the center of the trailer, breath caught in his throat. The silence and the hum seemed to merge into a single frequency. Everything inside him said that something was about to happen, and, when he finally mustered the courage to say something in a low voice, anything to break that suffocating tension. A shadow began to form at the end of the trailer. First a faint outline, then a more defined figure, emerging as if molded by the light itself. It was the beginning of an encounter that would change his life forever. David kept his eyes fixed on that shadow that slowly molded before him. The figure seemed to emerge from the vibration of the environment itself, as if it hadn't entered through the door, but been born there inside, fused with the walls, the air, the trembling light. David's heart pounded in his chest. His instincts screamed to run, but his legs were rooted, as if an invisible force compelled him to stay. The figure gained contours, tall, slender, with long arms and fluid movements that didn't resemble anything human, but also didn't seem hostile. The skin, if it could be called that, had a silvery, translucent sheen like liquid metal under the moonlight. The head was elongated, without hair, the eyes large and dark, but not opaque. There was a hypnotic depth in them, as if they reflected not the environment, but the mind of whoever looked into them. David tried to speak, but his throat failed. There was no need. The communication didn't happen through words. As soon as their eyes met, images began to arise in his mind, fast, intense, like fragments of dreams injected directly into his thoughts. He saw deserts on other planets, deep seas of colors he had never seen, immense structures floating in space like suspended cities. He felt the cold of distant atmospheres, the heat of nearby stars, the cosmic silence broken by pulses of energy. The shock was so great that he fell to his knees, but the figure didn't move toward him. It just continued transmitting, peaceful, like someone extending an invisible hand. David realized they weren't just images of places. They were memories, not his, but that presence's. As if the being were opening an ancient book and letting him leaf through its most secret pages. Amid the visions, flashes of previous encounters, other men and women, in different eras, in isolated places on the planet, always ordinary people, always on the margins of the world. Workers, wanderers, farmers, individuals forgotten by society, all facing the same presence. David breathed with difficulty. He felt his mind was being tested, as if the figure wanted to know how far he could endure. With each vision, a weight grew in his chest, but along with it a certainty arose. He wasn't facing a threat. He was facing an invitation. The metallic smell in the air intensified. Objects around began to levitate slightly, as if gravity inside was a momentary whim. The mug on the table spun slowly in the air. David's notebook, which he hadn't even noticed dropping, floated beside him, the pages opening on their own, as if an invisible wind were leafing through them. The being tilted its head slightly, and David felt a wave of calm wash over his body. It wasn't a word, but a clear sensation. Don't be afraid. Then, more specific images arose. He saw the coordinates he had noted days before, the strange symbol that had appeared on his paper. And finally, something that made him shudder, his own silhouette. David, walking to that place, entering the trailer, kneeling exactly as he was now. It was as if that entire moment had already been written before it happened. Tears began to stream down, silent. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the feeling of not being alone anymore after so many years. Maybe it was the crushing weight of finally seeing himself as part of something greater. The figure took a step forward. There was no sound, just that constant hum filling the space. As it approached, it extended one of its thin hands, with long, delicate fingers, toward David's chest. He didn't recoil. When the hand touched his shoulder lightly, a gentle discharge ran through his entire body. It didn't hurt, didn't burn. It was like a warm breath traversing every cell, awakening forgotten memories, childhood recollections, ancient laughter, smells of places he hadn't visited in decades. It was then that David understood that communication wasn't about technical knowledge, not a cold exchange of information. It was about connection. The being was showing that it knew his pain, his loneliness, his regrets. It was revealing that all of it wasn't irrelevant, that there was purpose even in his faded life. David raised his eyes again and saw the dark reflection staring at him with infinite patience. No words were needed. What came next, he already knew. Revelations that would go far beyond that first night. The silence inside the trailer seemed heavier than the desert air itself. David still felt the strange vibration coursing through his body, as if every cell was in tune with that presence. The being remained motionless, but the communication didn't stop. Without opening its mouth, without emitting sound, it began projecting new images directly into David's mind. This time, they weren't just fragments of memories or distant landscapes. They were patterns, symbols that repeated like formulas, lines of energy connecting stars, orbits that didn't follow the laws David knew. He saw celestial maps forming before his eyes, constellations not in any human atlas, entire systems interconnected by threads of light pulsing like veins in a living body. It was as if the universe wasn't just empty space and scattered matter, but a conscious, vibrant structure, organized in cycles that repeated for thousands of years. David, a simple mechanic, was seeing the cosmos as he had never imagined. The images changed. Now, faces of people emerged, ordinary men and women from different eras and places. A farmer in rural India, walking through the field and looking at the night sky. A young nurse on the outskirts of London in the 1940s, hearing voices while war sirens echoed in the distance. A solitary fisherman on the coast of Chile in 1978, spotting a light emerging from the sea. They all shared the same gaze, astonishment before something that didn't belong to Earth. David understood the message. Those encounters weren't rare, isolated events, weren't accidents. They were part of a cycle, always in remote places, always with anonymous people, invisible to society's great machine. Not generals, scientists, or politicians, forgotten people, without influence, without power, and exactly for that reason chosen. A sensation of recognition crossed David like a snap. He was exactly that. A forgotten man, invisible, someone whose life seemed to have left no marks. And now he understood. That was why he was there. The being projected more images. It showed ancient civilizations looking to the sky for answers. Cave paintings, symbols carved in stones, medieval manuscripts filled with strange figures, all left records of the same pattern, the same presence that now stood before him. It was an unbroken line linking human history to something much greater. David felt the ground oscillate under his feet. It wasn't just information, it was revelation. The alien was showing that humanity had been observed, guided, tested for millennia, and that now, in that specific time, the cycle had opened again. Suddenly, even more disturbing images arose. He saw illuminated modern cities, then shadows spreading like smoke. He saw seas churning, skies streaked with lights, people running amid chaos. It wasn't a clear prophecy, but a warning. Something was approaching, and these encounters were part of the preparation. David brought his hands to his head, trying to assimilate it all. It was too much information, an immense weight on his shoulders, but at the same time there was a strange peace. For the first time in years, he felt his life had a purpose, that every failure and every silence had been preparation for that moment. The figure tilted its head again, and David received the clear sensation he wasn't alone. Others in other places had also been called. They formed an invisible network, spread across the planet, connected not by human technology, but by something much deeper, a kind of spiritual frequency that only some could tune into. David understood. It wasn't luck, but sensitivity. These presences didn't seek leaders or geniuses, but those capable of perceiving the signs, of hearing the call in the silence of the night. The images ceased slowly, leaving only the low hum filling the space. David breathed with difficulty, but felt something inside him had opened. An internal portal, a space where mystery and purpose now coexisted. He raised his eyes again to the figure. He didn't need to ask anything. The answer was already clear in his mind. That didn't end there. It was just the beginning. The air inside the trailer seemed denser, as if the space had closed around David and the entity. The grave hum vibrating in the walls intensified until it became almost tangible, like an invisible heart beating in the same rhythm as his. The figure took a step forward, and the light emanating from its body illuminated the symbols drawn on the walls. They began to pulse, following the same beat, as if the entire structure was alive, breathing in unison with that encounter. David's skin prickled. He knew he was reaching a point of no return. Suddenly, the darkness around dissolved into an impossible spectacle. The trailer's ceiling disappeared before his eyes, and in its place appeared a starry sky, but not the sky he knew. Each star seemed linked by luminous energy lines, forming a colossal web that expanded in all directions. There was no void, everything was connected. The universe revealed itself as a pulsing, infinite, conscious organism. David raised his hand instinctively, trying to touch that vision. He felt a shiver run across his skin as he realized it wasn't an illusion. He was seeing through something, a technology perhaps, or a perception beyond the human. The being approached, and then, in its translucent hand, a small luminous object appeared. It was the size of a stone, but emitted a soft, almost organic glow that seemed to breathe. The light changed intensity with David's heartbeat, as if tuned to him. He understood without needing words. That was a key. Images succeeded in his mind. People in different points of the world receiving similar objects, all faced with the same choice. Some accepted and saw beyond, transformed forever. Others recoiled, returning the gift, going back to their ordinary lives, haunted by the memory of what they almost lived. David felt the pressure of that decision weigh on him. Part of his mind screamed that it was dangerous, that accepting would mean abandoning the life he knew. But another part, the deepest part, whispered that there was no life to return to. The rusty trailer, the rundown shop, the solitary nights, all of it had been just a weight. He extended his hand, trembling, and the object rested in his palm. Upon touching it, a soft warmth spread through his fingers, up his arm, and reached his chest. The sensation was of being connected to something much greater, as if invisible threads linked him to every corner of the cosmos. Then the images changed again. David saw Earth as never before, a blue sphere vibrating amid the stellar network. But along with the beauty, he also saw cracks, imbalances, a threatened future. The being transmitted the message without words. Time is narrowing, and few can see the signs. David understood he wasn't receiving just any gift. That was a call. The key wasn't just a symbol, but a tool. He could ignore it, try to bury what he had seen, and continue his life as if nothing had happened. Or he could accept and cross the invisible line, committing to live a reality from which there was no return. He closed his hand around the object. The light penetrated his skin, shining between his fingers, until it pulsed in sync with his heart. A tear ran down his tired face. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition. David raised his eyes to the figure, and at that instant, the message was clear. The choice is yours. The entire trailer vibrated as if waiting for his response. Gravity seemed to waver, objects floating around him, the air becoming rarefied. The universe watched that moment. For a long instant, David was silent, sweat trickling down his temples, heart pounding. But then, with a firm gesture, he raised his closed hand with the luminous key. He accepted. The instant David closed his hand around the luminous key marked the beginning of something irreversible. The object pulsed like a living heart, radiating waves that crossed his skin and coursed through every cell. It was as if his blood had been replaced by light. He felt his entire body vibrate in a tone that wasn't sound, but presence. An alignment so deep it was impossible to explain. The vision before him changed again. The trailer disappeared, the metal floor, the luminous symbols on the walls, even the alien figure. Everything dissolved into a white clarity that swallowed him completely. David found himself floating in a formless space, suspended between silence and resonance. There was no time, no space. There was only him, his memory, and that light pulsing in his hand. Then the images began to form. He saw his entire life pass before his eyes, not as loose memories, but as a continuous fabric. Childhood marked by his father's absence, youth full of wrong choices, the failed marriage, the distance from his son, the suffocating loneliness of the trailer in the desert. Every failure, every lost night in silence, every hidden tear, it all appeared before him, but not as pain. For the first time, he saw every piece of his story as part of a path that had led him to that moment. The losses weren't punishments. They were pushes. The pains weren't accidents. They were invisible molds, preparing him to endure and understand what was now revealed to him. David cried. He cried in a way he hadn't in years, but they were different tears, not of despair. They were tears of recognition. He understood, finally, that nothing had been in vain. When he opened his eyes again, the trailer reappeared around him, but it seemed larger, illuminated from within in a supernatural way. The figure was still before him, motionless, but its eyes now reflected something different. Approval, As if it had waited for that instant for a long time, David realized he was no longer the same. The object in his hand wasn't just a key, but a bridge. He could feel things that would have gone unnoticed before. The subtle rhythm of the wind outside, the vibration of every object in the space, even the presence of the entity before him. Not as a physical form, but as a clear and tangible essence. It was then that he understood. He wasn't alone. He was part of something greater. New images arose in his mind. Faces he had never seen but recognized immediately. Men and women in different places on the planet, each holding their own luminous key. Ordinary people, a truck driver on a road in Russia, a teacher in rural Africa, a monk high in the Himalayas, a lost boy on the streets of Mexico City. All different, but connected by the same light, by the same choice. David realized he was now part of that invisible network, a silent web of witnesses, scattered around the world, carrying secrets that could never be explained with words. People who, like him, had been shaped by life in silence until they were ready to see. The being extended its hand again, touching his forehead with the tip of its long, silvery fingers. And, in the same instant, David felt something open inside him. It wasn't just vision, it was perception. It was as if he could see hidden layers of reality, invisible patterns that had always been there, but that his human mind had never captured. Lines of energy connecting every star in the sky, every grain of sand in the desert, every heartbeat on the planet. He staggered, hand to his chest, trying to stay on his feet amid the avalanche of sensations. But there was no pain, only clarity. The universe wasn't a disordered chaos. It was a symphony. And now he could hear the music. When his eyes met the entities again, there was no more doubt. David had crossed the threshold. He was no longer the solitary man who fixed rusty cars in a rundown shop. He was part of something much greater, linked to a mission he didn't fully understand yet, but knew was real, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. The silence after the experience was almost deafening. The metallic trailer, which had vibrated with light and living symbols before, now seemed like just a carcass abandoned in the middle of the desert. The glow of the object in his hand faded softly, but he could still feel the discreet pulse, like a latent heart that would remain with him from then on. David breathed deeply, trying to get his bearings. He looked around and realized he was alone. The figure was no longer there, or perhaps it was in another form, invisible to the eyes, but present in a way his mind could now perceive. A silent presence, like the shadow of something eternal. He left the trailer. The cold early morning wind hit his face, bringing the fine desert dust. The sky was more starry than he ever remembered seeing, as if each point of light was a signal blinking at him. He walked slowly to his car, still dazed, and paused for a moment to look back. The trailer remained there, motionless, illuminated only by the pale moon. But deep down, David knew it wouldn't stay forever. He got in the car and turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered as it always did, but caught. He began driving back along Highway 375, heart tight and light at the same time. Each kilometre travelled felt like a farewell. When he reached mile marker 23, he looked in the rearview mirror. The desert was empty. The trailer had disappeared, as if it had never existed. When he arrived back at his trailer, the sky was already lightening. The old radio was in the same place, on the table. David stared at it for long minutes, waiting to hear the hiss, the voices, any sign. But nothing happened. The silence was absolute. For the first time in weeks, the device was dead. He spent the following days trying to assimilate what had happened. He went to the shop, but couldn't concentrate on the old engines. The people who came to repair their cars barely noticed him, but he observed them with a new gaze. He could see in them something he hadn't seen before. The invisible threads connecting every destiny. At night, he sat in front of the radio, waiting, but he knew it would only manifest again when the time was right. The key in his hand, now kept in a wooden box, was proof that it hadn't been a dream. Sometimes he held it and felt the same soft warmth, like a silent reminder that he had crossed to the other side of reality. David told no one. Who would believe? A solitary mechanic claiming to have encountered beings from another world. He understood that it wasn't meant to be shared with words, but with presence. The transformation was the true message. One early morning, while walking outside his trailer, he stopped to look at the sky. It was serene, immense, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel emptiness. He felt belonging, he smiled alone, but in a distant place, the story repeated itself. In a small town in rural Poland, an old radio, forgotten in the attic of a stone house, turned on by itself at 2:14 in the morning. The same hiss, the same numbers, the same metallic voice whispering, "Come, road, marker." A young student, unable to sleep, heard the call. She approached, frightened and fascinated, scribbling the numbers on a piece of paper. Unknowingly, she was beginning the same cycle that had changed David's life. The desert wasn't the only stage. The cycle continued, and it always would. And you? Do you believe encounters like this have already happened? Leave your opinion in the comments and share this video with someone who also loves mysterious stories. And if you're not subscribed yet, take the opportunity to join our community.